We're back to my storytelling. This will be my fourth of 5 stories for the weekend. So hopefully those of you who are repeat viewers aren't getting too bored of me yet. Tonight's topic I've chosen to call the Untouchables, Phi Alpha Delta and Al Capone. And again, I don't want anyone to get too excited that I'll be revealing the contents of the hidden vault or anything like that. One of my goals kind of in talking about choosing this topic was that people who may not be interested in researching Phi Alpha Delta history per se, like I have been, but who may find other topics, either political or historical topics of interest, realize that in almost any one of these things and significant events in the last 100 years of history, either political or legal or criminal or involving criminal justice, we can find Phi Alpha Delta members involved as part of those stories. And maybe they're not the Phi Alpha Delta members we know because they never became district justices or board members. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But literally that we know that the impact that our members have on life in general is incredible. And I decided to look at, since my Phi Alpha Delta historical interests have primarily been on Phi Alpha Delta's early history, which was centered here in Chicago. One of the big things in Chicago history from those early days was, of course, the development of organized crime in the time of Prohibition. And I was curious, since by that time Phi Alpha Delta had been a part of the legal community in Chicago for over 25 or 20, 25, 30 years, depending on what particular time you're looking at. I always thought, well, God, I bet P.A.Ds were really involved in that. And as it happened, when I was researching primarily some of the members of my own chapter, Webster chapter, I found that they were. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And just because I promised Capone, here he is, Alphonse Capone himself. And my stories that I'm going to tell today have to deal not always directly with Capone, but with some of those people that were players in the Chicago's war on organized crime. We had these rival gangs that were developing in Chicago and controlling different parts of the city. Initially, it was things like brothels, protection rackets, gambling, etc. Then Prohibition comes along, and we see this huge spike in criminal activity because now a large portion of the general population who were used to being able to get their liquor when they wanted it, and I think Phi Alpha Delta members can appreciate that, were suddenly deprived of a legal means of obtaining it. These gangs in Chicago decided that was a great opportunity to them to fill a need and to gain more power and more revenue. Al Capone became one of the most prominent of those Chicago crime lords in the 20s and early 30s. Controlling a huge network that stretched from Chicago to Canada, where his network brought in Canadian manufactured liquor to Chicago. And he was believed to control large elements of the police departments, the court system. The mayor of Chicago at the time was believed to be in Capone's pocket. And all this kind of, through a legal maneuver, ended when Capone was convicted not of the brothels or the protection rackets or running alcohol, but of tax evasion. So it's your legal system at work. So before I go into all that, I will say I'll take a moment to talk about Prohibition itself. Prohibition, as you know, was an animal created by the 18th Amendment, the only amendment in the Constitution designed to limit rights instead of expand them at that point. And the congressional act that sort of gave teeth to that constitutional amendment was the Volstead Act. I mention this here because this is where we already have a P.A.D player involved on a national scale, because when the act was initially approved by Congress, Brother Wilson, who was then president of the United States, who was initiated into Phi Alpha Delta when he was the governor of New Jersey by the Jefferson chapter at UVA, initially vetoed the Volstead Act. Mind you, Congress overrode his veto the same day he vetoed it. So it wasn't much of a delay. But this you see even as you'll see when I talk tonight, sort of at every level and every moment in this historical story unfolds, you have P.A.D members involved from top to bottom. So we'll talk a little bit about the political side. As I mentioned, Mayor William Hale Thompson, Big Bill Thompson as he was called, was believed to be in Capone's pocket, corrupt mayor. I think in the movie The Untouchables, when the police stop one of Capone's men and Elliot Ness wants to have him detained, he shows a note signed by the mayor asking any police officer who encounters this man to afford him every courtesy. And the police just kind of looked at Ness and said, well, he's protected, we're done. So that was Mayor Big Bill Thompson. And one of the progressive leaders in Chicago politics, Edward Litzinger, sort of led the movement within, Big Bill was a Republican. Litzinger represented the more progressive wing of the Republican Party in Chicago, and was several times, unfortunately, the unsuccessful appointment of Big Bill Thompson in the primary elections for mayor. And Brother Litzinger was actually one of the students who had started his legal education at Kent College of Law before Rule 39 was enacted, and was one of those affected whose rights were intended to be championed by the Law Student League. Later, he finished his legal education at Chicago Law School and became a member of my chapter, the Webster chapter. But he was leader of this progressive element, railing against corruption in the police department and the mayor's office. And because I thought there'd be some pet lovers online, I chose a picture of him with his dog to use as the visual here. So you see on the political level, Phi Alpha Delta is involved all along the way. People opposing the corrupt mayor in Chicago, Brother Wilson vetoing the Volstead Act initially. Then, of course, we get to the legal system, and we had P.A.D members on both sides in the criminal courts. So for the defense, I pulled one member because I thought he had an interesting story. This is Louis Housechild, who was also a member of my chapter, the Webster chapter at Chicago Law School. He actually served for 4 years as a faculty member at Chicago Law School. The faculty there were primarily all practicing attorneys that taught part-time. And Housechild was a active member of the criminal defense bar in Chicago, and he came to be more and more employed by what the newspapers were calling the beer gangs. And this is a picture of him I found in the paper where he's defending a gangster who kills one police officer rather, in Chicago. So I pulled that to share. Now, what makes his story interesting is at some point, it looks like his clients turned against him because his most prominent splash in the newspapers was when he's shot. At first, it's reported there was some kind of accident, maybe a hunting accident or something, but he makes these deathbed statements that implicate one of his clients, and it begins to be believed by the police department and the state's attorney's office that this is really he's being taken out by the gangs that he's been representing because he knows too much and is going to become a liability. And the other reason I chose these articles is because you'll see, although the articles are primarily about Brother Housechild, you start to see mention of the state's attorney who's been handling the case and the investigation. You see here about halfway down the third column, acting state's attorney Edgar A. Jonas opened a line in the investigation, blah, 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 blah. And you see as these articles go by that Brother Jonas, as you'll see, is taking an active role on the other side. And Brother Jonas is actually becomes a fairly prominent P.A.D. As well as a prominent lawyer and politician in Chicago. So Edgar A. Jonas is appointed first assistant to the state's attorney. He takes over a lot of these prosecutions as well as kind of heading some of these investigations into criminal activities by the gangs. Brother Jonas, I'm going to talk a little more about him because he actually did achieve some prominence in P.A.D. as well as public life. He was actually born in Wisconsin in 1885. After he finished his initial schooling, he became a teacher in Wisconsin before relocating to Chicago and enrolling in Chicago Law School in 1907. That was then the home of the Daniel Webster chapter before it moved to Loyola. In November of 1907, he was initiated by Webster chapter, and from 1908 to 1909, he actually was chapter justice at the Chicago Law School. He continues his P.A.D. career. He graduates law school in 1910, still represents Webster chapter at the convention. In 1911, he's one of the first members of the Chicago Alumni chapter, and he actually serves as Master of Ceremonies at the installation banquet for the Chicago Alumni chapter. Shortly thereafter, he's elected to serve as Supreme Vice Justice of the fraternity, while at the same time he was serving as Chicago Alumni chapter justice. And the following year, he is elected Supreme Justice of fraternity. So this is a leader of P.A.D. as well as someone who's taken a prominent role locally. In private life, he first serves as Assistant Corporate Counsel for City of Chicago, then as First Assistant State's Attorney. Then he's elected to the Municipal Court and then the Superior Court. Later, he continues his involvement in criminal justice, becoming a member of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. Finally, he ends up serving several years in the U.S. as a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives before he retires and eventually passes away in 1965. So this, again, is someone who played a prominent role in P.A.D. as well as a prominent role in the criminal justice, legal, and political system of Chicago, and eventually in the Congress of the United States. So that's my brother Edgar Jonas. So although Brother Jonas ended up on the bench, he's not the one I've chosen to talk about as someone who's involved in the fight on organized crime from the bench. I'm instead going to talk about another Webster chapter member, the Honorable John Homer Lyle. I was preparing this PowerPoint while engaged in the social hour this morning, so I apologize for the typo. Brother Lyle, again, is a member of Webster chapter. He served first as an Assistant State's Attorney, then for 5 years in the Illinois State Legislature, then as an alderman on the Chicago City Council till 1925. In 1925, he's elected judge. And this is where he becomes sort of the untouchable judge in the Al Capone story. You remember Capone was believed to control the judges, the police, the mayor's office, basically every aspect of city government to protect his empire. And this was the judge that Capone could not control. So Judge Lyle becomes sort of famous as a relentless nemesis of organized crime. He actually coined the term public enemies. Now you hear public enemy number one. That was actually his term for the leaders of organized crime. He gained the reputation in Chicago as being the only judge that Capone could not buy. And in fact, it was Brother Lyle who issued the warrant for Capone's arrest on charges of tax evasion in 1930. He also issued some other warrants along the way that some of our brothers and sisters and siblings who are involved in criminal defense may find questionable under today's standards, but he was fighting organized crime, and he felt he was a champion of the law. So he did a lot of amazing things to sort of lead that battle from the bench, and he would not be controlled. So I did want, if any of you want to learn more about Judge Lyle and his involvement in the fight on organized crime, before his death, he actually published a book, which you probably can't see here, but I have a copy of, which is called The Dry and Lawless Years by John Homer Lyle. And this is sort of the insider's view of the whole development of organized crime in Chicago and the legal battles to control it. It's not currently in print, but you can find copies of it available for purchase if you Google on eBay and other sources, book dealers. So I was able to find a copy of it. So again, my goal here was not to give you really a detailed history of organized crime in Chicago or a detailed history of any of the many P.A.D members who were part of the legal and political system that might have been involved in that rise of organized crime and the battle against organized crime. But again, just to highlight the fact that as we look at other things in history that might be of interest, maybe another view we can take is when we're hearing so-and-so's involved, take a moment and consider, were these P.A.D members? Is this a way that maybe something about their involvement in Phi Alpha Delta helped prepare them for these careers, or helped prepare them for the task the part they played in these events? And I hope that I was successful in doing that a little bit. Again, my whole theme for the weekend is reminding you that Phi Alpha Delta isn't just the history, the story of the organization. It's not just, this happened on this date at this convention, we decided this chapter was installed then. It's all these stories like the ones you're hearing from John and Curtis and others on the line about things that were happening to our individual members, the lives our individual members led, and how they impacted our society. Because really in our 120 years of history, we really have had an incredible impact on the events in our nation's history. So I hope all of you, when you're studying things or looking at things that are of interest to you, you realize how many of those things involve members of Phi Alpha Delta. Particularly as one of our Phi Alpha Delta brothers right now is addressing the nation, having just been elected to be our next president of the United States. Although it's not certified yet, but it's certainly the most likely next president of the United States. And that's the kind of impact Phi Alpha Delta has come to have on our country and its politics and its justice system.